It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when everything began to unravel. Sarah, my wife of 8 years, was doing laundry in our small sunlit kitchen. She hummed softly to herself as she folded the clothes fresh out of the dryer, the kind of peaceful domestic moment that made me think everything in our life was perfect. If you'd asked me that morning, I would have said I had it all: a stable career, a beautiful wife, and the kind of marriage most people envied. But that afternoon, everything changed with one tiny detail. Something I almost missed but couldn't shake once it was in my head. It started when Sarah threw one of her sweaters into the wash. She'd worn it earlier that week when she'd been out with friends. It wasn't until I walked past the laundry pile later that I smelled it. A scent that was undeniably masculine. Cologne, but not the kind I wore. It was sharp, musky, and foreign to me, lingering faintly on the soft wool of her sweater. My first thought was that maybe she'd hugged someone, or maybe it had rubbed off during her night out. I didn't think too much of it at the time, but the scent stuck with me. Over the next few days, little things started to add up. Sarah had been more distant lately, absent-minded, her attention elsewhere, even when we were together. She was on her phone more than usual, always quick to put it down whenever I walked into the room. And then there were the sudden work meetings or girls' nights out that seemed to crop up more and more frequently. I brushed off my growing suspicion, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. After all, Sarah had never given me any reason not to trust her. We'd always had a solid relationship, built on years of shared experiences and deep conversations that could stretch late into the night. If something was wrong, she'd tell me, right? But that damn cologne, it haunted me. Every time I caught a whiff of it, that seed of doubt grew larger. One evening, I decided to confront her, but in my own way. After she'd gone to bed, I went downstairs and checked her laundry again. I don't know what I was expecting to find, but I needed to confirm whether I was losing my mind. I picked up the sweater again, and there it was, that same cologne. This time I brought it to my nose, inhaling deeply. It wasn't just a passing scent. It was embedded into the fabric, clinging to it in a way that couldn't have been accidental. My heart started racing. Maybe I was overthinking it, but everything suddenly felt wrong. I couldn't sleep that night. Sarah lay beside me, breathing softly, while I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts spinning out of control. I tried to come up with innocent explanations. Maybe it was her coworker, or maybe it was someone at the bar where she'd met her friends. But the sinking feeling in my stomach told me that none of those explanations made sense. The next day, I decided to do something I never thought I'd do. After Sarah left for one of her meetings, I grabbed her phone. I knew her passcode. There were no secrets between us, at least none that I thought I had to worry about. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it, part of me hoping I wouldn't find anything and that I was just being an insecure fool. But then I saw the messages. They weren't glaring at first, just texts from a number I didn't recognize, but the tone was off. I scrolled up, my stomach twisting tighter with every line I read. There were no explicit messages, but there was an unmistakable familiarity in the way they communicated. Too friendly, too intimate for just co-workers or friends. They had been meeting up during the day while I was at work and exchanging messages that were just vague enough to hide something underneath. The final nail in the coffin was when she mentioned wearing her favorite sweater the last time they'd met. The same sweater I had pulled from the laundry. My chest tightened, a cold wave of disbelief washing over me. The truth was staring me in the face, and I couldn't deny it anymore. Sarah, my wife, the woman I had built my life around, was cheating on me. I dropped her phone, my mind numb, unable to process the betrayal. The room around me seemed to spin, my world crumbling in slow motion, as I realized I wasn't just losing Sarah. I was losing the life I thought we had together. But as the initial shock started to fade, something else took its place. Anger. Not the fiery, out-of-control kind, but a cold, calculating rage. If this was how she wanted to play, I'd make sure she wouldn't walk away from this unscathed. That cold rage simmered under the surface for the next few days as I tried to act like nothing had changed. I went through the motions, waking up, going to work, coming home, while Sarah carried on as if everything between us was fine. She still smiled when we spoke, kissed me goodbye before leaving for her meetings, and curled up next to me on the couch when we watched TV at night. But every time she touched me, I felt a jolt of anger. How could she be so close to me, look me in the eye, and lie so effortlessly? It made me sick to my core. I knew I couldn't confront her right away. The pain was too fresh, and I needed a plan. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a dramatic argument or a messy emotional scene. No, I wanted to hit her where it hurt. I wanted to make sure that when I walked away, she'd feel the weight of what she'd done. So I did what I had to do. I met with a lawyer. I'll never forget the look on Sarah's face that evening when I casually mentioned I had to work late. It was a lie, of course. Instead of heading to the office, I drove downtown to a firm I'd found after a bit of online research. My lawyer, Alan, was no nonsense, with a reputation for being ruthless in court. That was exactly what I needed. I explained the situation to Alan, starting from the cologne to the messages I'd found on her phone. He listened carefully, taking notes. But the moment I mentioned infidelity, his demeanor changed. He leaned forward, his eyes sharpening with interest. "Do you have evidence of the affair?" he asked. I hesitated. I hadn't confronted Sarah directly, and while the texts were enough for me to know something was going on, I didn't have concrete proof. "I don't have much," I admitted. "Just some messages, but they're not explicit." Alan nodded, unfazed. "It's a start. We can subpoena her phone records, dig through her emails. If she's been careless, we'll find something." His confidence was reassuring, but I was still feeling the sting of betrayal. "And what about the divorce itself? I want this over, but I don't want her walking away with anything. She doesn't deserve a damn thing after this." Alan leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips. "If we can prove infidelity, we can make sure she walks away with nothing. Your assets, the house, even alimony. She won't see a penny." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. We spent the next hour discussing strategy. Alan was thorough, asking about our finances, the house, and any joint accounts we had. He advised me to start gathering any documents or information I could. Bank statements, credit card records, anything that might show suspicious activity. He also mentioned hiring a private investigator to track Sarah's movements. If she was meeting someone in secret, we needed to catch her in the act. I left the office that night feeling strangely empowered. The pain of Sarah's betrayal still gnawed at me, but now I had something to focus on, something to fight for, and if I was going to fight, I was going to win. The next few weeks were a blur of careful preparation. I couldn't let on that anything was wrong, so I played the part of the loving husband while quietly building my case. I dug through our finances looking for unexplained purchases or withdrawals. Sure enough, there were charges I didn't recognize, meals at restaurants I'd never been to, hotel stays that Sarah had never mentioned. Each discovery was like a knife twisting deeper into the wound, but it only fueled my resolve. Meanwhile, the private investigator Alan recommended was already on the job. He was discreet, following Sarah on her work trips and girls' nights to see where she really went. It didn't take long for him to find what we were looking for. After a few days, he emailed me a series of photos. Sarah meeting a man in the parking lot of a hotel, the same man who had been messaging her, the two of them, wrapped in each other's arms, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. I stared at those photos for what felt like hours. There was no longer any room for doubt. She was cheating on me, brazenly. And all this time, she'd thought she was getting away with it. But now I had the proof. It was time to put the final plan in motion. I met with Alan again, showing him everything I'd collected. The bank statements, the hotel charges, and now the damning photos. He was impressed by how thorough I'd been. "You've built a solid case," he said, nodding. "We can proceed. I'll file the paperwork, and we'll make sure she doesn't see a dime when this is over." Hearing those words felt like the first bit of relief I'd had in weeks. But there was still one more thing I needed to do before the legal battle began. I needed to confront Sarah. There was no going back after this. I knew that. But I wasn't going to let her walk into this divorce blindsided. She had no idea what was coming, no idea that I'd been watching her every move for weeks. And now that I was armed with the truth, it was time for her to face it too. The day I confronted Sarah was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. I had rehearsed it so many times in my head, but when the moment actually came, everything seemed to move in slow motion, the calm before the storm. It was a Friday evening, just like any other. Sarah had come home later than usual, her excuse about another work meeting already prepared, but I didn't care what story she had to spin this time. I wasn't playing along anymore. She walked into the kitchen, dropping her purse on the counter and flashing me a tired smile. "Sorry I'm late. It's been a long day." "You know how it is," she said, her voice casual, almost rehearsed. I stood by the kitchen table, my hands resting on the back of a chair, watching her. It felt strange, knowing what I did and seeing her act so normal, so comfortable in her lies. Yeah, I said, my voice unnervingly calm. I know exactly how it is. She glanced at me, a flicker of confusion crossing her face at my tone. Everything okay? I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, tapping it to bring up the pictures the private investigator had sent me. I set the phone on the table, the images facing up for her to see. Why don't you tell me, Sarah? Everything okay with you? She walked over, her eyes drifting down to the phone. The moment she saw the pictures, her face went pale. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at the photos. Her, standing outside the hotel, locked in an embrace with another man. Her breath caught in her throat, and I could see the panic starting to rise in her eyes. What is this? What do you think it is? I asked, my voice still calm, but my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes darted back and forth between the pictures and me, as if she were trying to piece together some way to explain this away. But there was no explaining it. There was no lie big enough to cover what she'd done. You've been lying to me, I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper, but each word felt like a hammer driving into the walls of our marriage. You've been cheating on me, Sarah, and I know everything. She backed away from the table, her hands trembling as she brought them up to her face. Wait, please, just let me explain. I shook my head. Explain? Explain what? That you've been sneaking around behind my back, sleeping with someone else while I've been sitting here, believing we were still a team? That's not something you explained, Sarah. That's something you did. Over and over. Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a moment, I thought she might collapse. I didn't mean for it to happen, she whispered, her voice breaking. I swear I didn't. It just happened. Things between us. I don't know, I felt so distant from you, and I didn't know how to talk about it. Distant, I repeated, my voice rising. You felt distant, so you thought the answer was to sleep with another man? To lie to me every time you left the house? Every time you got a message from him? How long has this been going on, Sarah? How long have you been making me look like a fool? She wiped at her eyes, her words tumbling out between sobs. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for it to get this far. I never wanted to hurt you. I still love you. I do. Don't. I cut her off, the anger finally breaking through the calm I'd been holding on to. Don't tell me you love me? You don't get to say that after what you've done. She took a step toward me, her hand outstretched, but I moved back. I couldn't stand the thought of her touching me. Not anymore. Please, she begged. Let's fix this. We can go to therapy. I'll stop seeing him, I swear. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. I laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. It was bitter, hollow. Make this right? There's no making this right, Sarah. It's over. I've already filed for divorce. Her eyes widened, the words hitting her like a slap to the face. Divorce? She whispered, as if she hadn't even considered it a possibility. Yeah, I said, my voice hardening. I'm done. You don't get to lie to me for months, who knows, maybe years, and then expect me to forgive you like nothing happened. I'm not that guy. You betrayed me, and now you're going to live with the consequences. She collapsed into the chair by the table, her head in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Please don't do this. I made a mistake. I'll do anything. Please, I can't lose you. I stared at her for a long moment, my chest tightening as I watched the woman I'd once loved fall apart in front of me. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for her, to remember the good times we'd shared and the life we'd built together. But another part of me, probably the bigger part, felt nothing but cold, righteous anger. You already lost me, Sarah, I said softly. The moment you chose him over me, you lost everything. Her sobs only grew louder, and I turned away, unable to watch anymore. I grabbed my keys off the counter and headed for the door. Just as I reached it, I paused, glancing back at her one last time. You should probably start packing, I said quietly. You're not getting the house. You're not getting anything. With that, I walked out. The divorce process moved quickly. Alan had filed the paperwork the day after we'd met, and with the evidence we had, Sarah didn't stand a chance. She tried to fight at first, begged me to reconsider, but as the reality of the situation set in, she grew quieter, more resigned. It was like watching her spirit drain out of her bit by bit. The court wasn't kind to her. Between the photos, the financial records, and the testimony from the private investigator, there was no room for sympathy. The judge ruled in my favor on every count: division of assets, alimony, even the house. Sarah was left with nothing but the clothes she could pack in her car. The day she left, I stood by the window, watching as she carried the last of her things to the curb. She didn't look up at me. She didn't say goodbye. She just drove off, leaving behind the life we'd built together. I thought I'd feel triumphant, victorious, but the truth was, I didn't feel much of anything. The anger had burned out, and all that remained was a kind of quiet emptiness. It wasn't relief. It wasn't peace. It was just the end. But as the days passed, something else began to settle in, a strange, unfamiliar sense of freedom. For the first time in a long while, I didn't have to look over my shoulder, didn't have to wonder what was really going on behind the scenes. The lies were gone, the betrayal dealt with, and I was left with a blank slate. It wasn't the life I'd expected to have, but it was mine now, and that was enough.